Today is Friday, April 17th, 10 a.m. Miami time, and I'm speaking with Alejandro Portes. Alejandro, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
My pleasure.
Alejandro, can you describe where you are now and how the events surrounding this recent pandemic have changed the structure of your life and work?
I am in Miami, in my home, like everyone else, at the request of the dean of the law school, and I have been completing my course on immigration and ethnicity via internet with my students, and working in various projects in the same way, interacting with my assistants at the University of Miami and Princeton University, and completing various projects. So basically, we are those of us who are privileged enough to work with our mind and with our heads rather than with our hands, have the possibility of continuing in some form the progress in our projects, even in this new world that had been created to us. So, by and large, the short answer to your question is I'm doing pretty well.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. So perhaps the fact that we have been isolated from one another in a new physical reality, meaning all in our homes, I'm wondering if you've been able to reflect or think about what these recent events or how these recent events might impact the future of the built environment, and perhaps hear a little of your thoughts about that.
The first thing to notice is, of course, the uneven geography of the pandemic that we're suffering, where some cities and countries are more than others. That is internationally, I noticed that southern countries like Spain and Italy, and especially their urban areas, have been hit very hard. Scandinavian countries have not been hit that hard at all. Sweden have not completely closed. We do not hear anything about a huge pandemic in Finland or Norway. And in that sense, that's an interesting division, which prompts the question why. In North America, we see that large northern cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, and Detroit have been very heavily affected, while those in the South, with the exception of New Orleans, have been less so, at least up to now. And I think that has to do. There is some relationship between that and density, and therefore the way that urban designs have been in the past and that cities have been constructed. Spanish and Italian cities are largely built on the medieval mold of very narrow streets, tight construction, one house next to another, not much open space. They are in the sense they tend to concentrate population in a greater way than the cities in Scandinavia that had been more sort of open space and less tightly built. Helsinki looks just like Madison, Wisconsin, for example. It's completely open in that sense. And in North America, that is clearly the fact that New York brings in so many people tightly packed in a relatively reduced space. Even going to the suburbs of New Jersey and so on, seem to have some association with the crisis that this city had been facing, as opposed to others, including, and in the case of New Orleans, aside from the celebration of Mardi Gras, which seemed to have been the triggering event there, the center of New Orleans is also built in a European mold, that dating from its French past, so it's also relatively tightly built. So that is like my good friend Richard Florida noted in the recent article that you shared with me. Density is is a very important consideration. Is in a sense, density is the opposite of social distancing. A word, by the way, that I don't like, because it is not social distancing; it's physical distancing. And of course, density is the opposite of physical distancing, and therefore it provides greater opportunities for these kinds of events. The whole point is that uh, density more than climate, because of course the Scandinavian cities are much colder than Southern European ones, and yet their performance so far in the midst of this crisis had been better. So has been Russia. Indicates that there is a question in terms of the way the level at which people are physically contiguous, and the cities that tend to be more built on the, let's say, the European mold that had medieval origins in France, Italy, and Spain. So I don't want to belabor the point, because of course density is only one of the variables at play in terms of the extension of this crisis. But as it has before I leave that, let me give you this thought. In the 14th century, during the Black Plague, that killed 1/3 of the European urban population, the people who could, that had the means and so on, try to avoid death and the plague by moving away from the cities. If they had a country villa, if they had some castle in the countryside, they moved there. That was exactly what one well-known Florentine poet, Boccaccio, did in the 14th century. That is, he took off from Florence to avoid the plague, and set out in a country village where, having nothing better to do and no internet at that time, he proceeded to write the Decameron, the famous series of stories that he wrote for his own entertainment and those of his friends in that villa. So even at that time, the idea of creating distance was very important as a way of saving yourself and yours, and providing that. The story of Boccaccio also has an interesting element, which I think Florida also pointed out in his analysis, and which to me as a sociologist is fundamental, is the class element of the pandemic. That is not, if you had here in South Florida, if you had rural a place in Homestead or a villa in the Keys, probably you would go there to spend the time that we have to be in seclusion, because it would be distance it would create physical distance, and it would be, in a sense, enjoyable and so on. Not all of us have a house in the Keys or a big rural property, and therefore we have to stay in the city. But at the opposite end, there is the fact that while the upper classes, well, that is especially those who are not only wealthy but who are employed in what Florida calls the creative enterprises, who work with their minds, tend to be better able to withstand the crisis because of our economic means and our type of work that can be done in the way that we are doing while maintaining physical distance. That is not the same for the mass of the working classes that have to work with their hands and with their physical effort, and that have to be physically at work every day. The mail carriers, the deliverers, the grocery shop, the supermarket employees, you name it, many of them. So as it happened in Florence in the 14th century, and as it happened in the world at the beginning of the 19th century, or during the so-called Spanish flu of the 1918 to 20, the pandemic is more likely to hit the more vulnerable elements of the population, including primarily the working classes. We know, of course, that age is an important element in creating in creating vulnerability to this, but that is well known. That is that the older population is more vulnerable. But aside from that, I think that this element, we are going to see clearly a division in terms of the relative socioeconomic status of the population of the cities most heavily affected. In that respect, I noticed that Manhattan, which is tightly packed within New York, had been less relatively. No, they have had a lot of cases, but relatively less hit than the other suburbs, the other counties in New York, like Queens, Bronx, and the New Jersey suburbs, which is where the working classes actually live. They tend to live there in Queens, the Bronx, and so on, and move themselves where Manhattan is populated by generally the people who live there are of upper socioeconomic status. So in that sense, there will be a clear class element as well as a spatial element in the way that this thing behaves, and that's I think should say to us that sure, it is something that is aside from the epidemiological characteristics and the characteristic of the virus, which belongs to biological science and medicine. There will be a social element in the way that this historical episode that we are living through plays itself out in the end.
Alejandro, I think you raise a very, very important points, and it makes me maybe want to follow up with one or two questions. And the examples that you mentioned, for example, Boccaccio and others, were temporary displacements by, let's say, the upper class to less dense areas, which is happening today as well. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you believe that it will be like in the past, a sort of temporary displacement, and then people will return to the cities, or do you believe that this could ignite a more permanent kind of decentralization of cities? That would be one question.
That's a very important question. It depends on how hard it hits and how long it hits. If it is a question of a year at most, I would assume that life will return to normal more or less. The changes probably will be less in the physical structure of cities than in attempts to maintain greater public hygiene and in the world of work, our world, in a shift to the greater use of this medium of the use of virtual encounters, of webinars, and of robots to take care of the things that you have to touch with your hands. That is likely to work itself, but I don't see, unless it lasts longer than a year, a tendency to a major restructuring of cities or major design. People will forget, and that they will return to whatever it is. But the interesting thing is that just without intention, the cities of the South and Southwest, the new cities have been built more for the car than for pedestrians. That's what we people who love cities always decry about Los Angeles, Phoenix, Tempe, Miami, and so on. These are cities of cars, nor cities like the ones that we like to visit so much: Paris, Rome, Madrid, and cities of people. Well, unintentionally, these cities built for cars create physical distance. It is much easier to expand because they are more open. They use space much more than the tightly built cities in Europe and in the Northeast, and that turns out to be an advantage at this time. However, to wrap up the question, I think that unless the pandemic continues, the tendency, I think, would be by and large to a return for life, for a return to life as usual.
And yeah, I was also thinking as you were speaking, you spoke about the more vulnerable communities, the most vulnerable among us. And from your perspective as a sociologist, I was curious, how do you think that when we return to, let's say, the normal, whatever that might be, that we can construct more equitable cities?
Well, I think that there are two elements that come to mind in answering your question. The first is the evidence, what is happening, the racial division in terms of the vulnerability to the virus, especially the white-black division and the much greater impact that it's having among African Americans. That ethnic division that we are already seeing is also a class division, of which I was referring before. That is, when you say African Americans, that almost is a pseudonym for a relative less wealthy population, a population that is concentrated in the working classes, and that have to work, and that is actually tends to be more physically concentrated in the inner cities. The inner cities are are very physically concentrated, and that's where a good part of the African American population concentrates. So this will be a lesson, and I think that probably would be an argument in terms of for those who are more interested in promoting greater racial equality and stopping the vast inequalities that exist in American society and that are being seen and are being reflected in the relative vulnerability to the present crisis, to the present pandemic. The other element that I think is important, Carie, is what happens to working class immigrants, to labor immigrants who have been greatly demonized in recent years, especially since the advent of the present administration, as illegals and robbers and people who commit crimes and therefore have to be deported. And there has not been one single positive comment about Mexican rural workers in the Southwest or here in the Southeast or Caribbeans and so on. Everything has been negative coming from the administration about getting rid of this foreign element that is seen as, that had been described as in many ways undeserving. Well, these are the people who are doing the work. This to a large extent, these immigrants, whether with a temporary visa or in undocumented status, are the ones who are picking up the crops and continue working in agriculture and continue working in the meat packing plants throughout, and therefore and supporting the food lines that are in a sense vital for all of us. These are the people who are working in construction, in buildings, still here, even in Miami. From my window, I can see buildings being still built, and workers. They are overwhelmingly immigrants or African Americans. These are the groups that are really on, because of their status and so on, are providing vital vital labor and vital support for a number of economic industry lines that otherwise would have to stop, would have to break. So I think that the key point in this second element, in this second issue, is that we are going to there's going to be a vindication of the centrality of immigration, especially labor immigration, for vast sectors of the American economy, and a re-evaluation of the role of this immigrant population that is in these so difficult times is doing so important work for all of us.
Yes, Alejandro, thank you really for those thoughtful and I would also argue thought-provoking words. I'm very grateful that you took a few minutes from your day to speak with me, and I look forward to a continued conversation and hope that you and your family are safe and well, and that we will be able to connect sooner rather than later on the physical campus.
Same to you, Carie, and it's a pleasure to see you even virtually. I look forward to do it in person when the situation allows us to do so.
Yes, the same. Thank you so much.